It is 9 minutes past 10 in the morning on Monday, the 29th of June, and I'm here today with Nickolai Hubble for another market broadcast. Now, in today's podcast, we'd like to discuss a theme that we've been writing about here at Southbank for quite some time, but which has steadily been gaining more and more momentum. And in the wake of the Wu flu crisis, it's something that's gotten faster and faster, and that is the West's relationship with China. Now, in terms of we could spend hours probably discussing just how important the role of China has been in the global economy for some time now, especially post financial crisis, where everybody has looked to China as a source of global growth and as a source of expanding international power, but also a source of expanding corporate profits in places like the US. Now, as the West and the East, and especially the US and China, have faced off against each other, and the relationship has been much more antagonistic, what I would call a second Cold War, the risk to investors get higher and higher and higher. Now, we've written quite a lot about this, of the various sort of triggers that could become very important, very significant for investors as time goes on. We've looked at the South China Sea. We've looked at the appalling atrocities that the Chinese Communist Party are perpetrating against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But Nikolai, there have been some quite interesting developments now. Could you share them with our listeners? Because it's important to get ahead of the news, I think, on this thing.
Yeah, a lot of the things that we predicted would happen have started to play out. There's a lot of attention, a lot of policy changes, a lot of suggested policy changes. It's all starting to gain the traction that we said it would in our report back a few months ago now. And that report was quite shocking because it really went into detail on the types of atrocities happening in Xinjiang and identified that as the sea change in Western attitudes towards China. Basically because anyone anti-China now had the moral high ground, given what's going on in Xinjiang. And the Telegraph, I think it's today's, reported on how there's forced sterilization occurring in Xinjiang. There's not many people that were willing to say that in a mainstream newspaper only a few months ago, and yet now there's a fair bit of detail in there. In Australia, we've had actually some politicians caught up in some controversy over whether China was, backing them financially or influencing their policies. We've had the Australian intelligence organisations investigating politicians, state-level politicians, over their ties to the Communist Party, and this is only beginning. It's only just started to gain traction in Australia, and Australia is especially interesting because it's so economically reliant on China in so many different ways. We've also had, I think it's a British policy institution based on one of the big universities, recommending that Boris Johnson reviews his attitudes towards China, given the changing mood and what's been exposed about China's practices. Until a few months ago, he seemed quite comfortable with Huawei providing the UK's 5G network. Now that's changed. What else is going to change? And this policy institute was suggesting a lot actually should. And then you've got the broader story, again connected to 5G. You had the Singapore telecoms rollout of 5G using Ericsson and Nokia's infrastructure and goods and services instead of Huawei's. So I'm sure there's countless other examples and plenty that I've forgotten that I was going to mention. But the point being that all of this anti-China sentiment that we predicted would come to the fore is coming to the fore now, and the economic and financial market consequences of that come next.
Yeah, I think we really are it's very early days for what true US-China and UK-China decoupling would actually look like. I think this is more sort of the momentum building, and the press is beginning to cover it in a way that might provoke more political responses to it. But in terms of what we think is going to come next, where do you think the next sort of trigger, or the next event, the next move might be in this sort of decoupling relationship? It's been very interesting to watch how anti-China sentiment, or anti-communist party sentiment rather, has spread and become, in the US, has become quite bipartisan. and it's becoming more that way, or it feels to be more that way within the UK political establishment. What do you think might be one of the moves that gets made next? Because interestingly, and this is more of an aside, but it's actually today is that Luckin Coffee gets delisted from the US stock exchange as a result of accounting fraud. And one of the things that has allowed these kind of frauds to take place is that Chinese companies which list in the US don't actually have to abide by the same accounting principles that US companies do. And it feels like it wouldn't be much of a a leap to just for the rules to be changed and to make sure those accounting rules are actually being followed by Chinese companies that wanted to list in the US, for example. It doesn't feel that there would be a great, there wouldn't need to be a great political move to make that happen. And it feels like quite a small leap for that time, but it would have a big impact on the valuations of some of these massive Chinese companies. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's the big one, I think, the accounting rules, because it's such a blatant attempt to bow down to China in order to gain more influence and more connections to the big economy that's growing and so on and so forth. And it shouldn't be hard to reverse that as a first step. And I think it would do a lot of damage to Chinese attempts to spread their corporate influence around the world. But you've got all around Europe, similar things are happening. The Europeans are getting sick of Chinese trade practices. And then you've got in places like Africa, where the Belt and Road Initiative is rolling out, people are getting sick of, they call them the debt traps, where the Chinese government lends money in order in exchange for control and influence in the economic project that they're funding. So there's a lot of fight back happening, a lot of different places financially, and I think it's worth selling out of stocks in Hong Kong, in China, and Chinese companies listed in markets around the world. The thing that I'm waiting for more than anything, though, is the same thing that made Brexit happen, and I think it's that politician who makes this their big cause, and becomes famous for this one thing only of being anti-Chinese, and that person gaining enough traction that it forces the other political parties to shift in order to hold their share of the vote. So obviously I'm thinking of Nigel Farage and what he did for the Brexit campaign. I think we'll have the same sort of thing for the Chinese exit, where you have the firebrand politician who is a one-issue campaigner, and that forces the other politicians and the other political parties to shift, to change their ways, to be anti-China if they don't want to lose votes to the firebrand politician. And that's what ends up making the whole process happen. That's what ends up forcing governments to really take this issue seriously. In the end, it's political accountability that makes people move.
Right. I mean, the example I look for more historically is a little further back with Senator Joseph McCarthy. I do feel like there's going to be another. As you say, I am anticipating the arrival of a figure who can shift the Overton window, as you describe, and make anti-CCP sentiment, cool, like to make it politically fashionable, and at the same time to stoke a huge amount of fear and anxiety over the Chinese Communist Party's reach inside the Western establishment. If you look at just the manner in which the Chinese Party has sort of infiltrated a lot of academic institutions in this country, or if you look to the think tank industry, or you look to all manner of just pharmacological companies, even some of the arms manufacturers have committed some pretty incredible sort of security breaches in an attempt to make sure that Chinese students and Chinese money is allowed to flow into their businesses. It does feel like there is somebody. Maybe they're already in the political sphere. Maybe we've already seen them, but they've yet to just take this issue and make it their issue. To make McCarthyism 2.0. The next big political hammer that they can swing at their opponents effectively, and accuse them of being China appeasers, and all manner of things. And as you say, if they've got the moral high ground of saying the Chinese Communist Party is committing just utterly blood curdling atrocities in Xinjiang. I mean, do you really have much of a position to stand on? It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. One thing that I noticed that is sort of a part of this whole story was, I'm not sure you've seen it, that it's on Wednesday, Taiwan is going to open an office that is dedicated to getting Hong Kong residents and businesses to relocate to Taiwan, which I found very interesting. And it's another, it's yet another sort of symptom, I suppose, of Hong Kong losing its autonomy to mainland China. But at the same time, the struggle that's and the pressure that's building, I guess, even more than it already was between Taiwan and mainland China. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and the Taiwanese just had an election, I think, and there's a lot of protests there. They call it the Sunflower Movement, where they're worried about Chinese influence in Taiwan, and Taiwan's going to remain a big issue. But I think Taiwan feels quite far away. So I've got lots of connections to Japan through family, and they see Taiwan as the stepping stone to Japan for the Chinese Communist Party, effectively, militarily, economically, whatever it is. That's why they care so much about Taiwan. So it's been a big focus for me. And then you're interested in it, obviously, because we've taken such an interest in this new Cold War idea, and that's where the flashpoint is. But for the British investor and British people, obviously Hong Kong is much closer to their hearts for obvious reasons. And that's why Boris had that plan to do what the Taiwanese wanted to do as well, to invite a lot of people from Hong Kong to the UK. It's basically, you get to pick and choose who you want from Hong Kong. And you really could steal basically a huge chunk of some of the world's most productive citizens who speak English and know how to do business, British style legal system. So it just seems like such a good opportunity. But I don't know how they can sell it given the immigration pitches that they've made to reduce immigration into the UK. So far, none of this has been. Nobody has stood up as that firebrand politician and said anyone who supports Huawei in China also supports forced sterilization using chili paste in Uyghur camps or live organ harvesting of Uyghurs. No one's really come out and said that, has been willing to stake their career on it. And I think that's just going to be the only moment that really matters. Because if nobody stands up and says what is going on in Xinjiang in a brutal way, that accuses anyone of being that accuses anyone who is pro China of being a very bad person. Until that happens, I don't think anyone will be forced to do anything about this.
Yeah, but at the same time, I feel it is inevitable that somebody will. I mean, that's the political power that could be achieved by the person who can sell that and who can get away with saying that, making an enemy of this external threat. Feels to me as you describe, if someone like Nigel Farage can make a career out of bashing the European Union, then surely somebody can do it with the Chinese Communist Party. Interestingly, on the topic of Hong Kong, Wednesday will be the 23rd anniversary of the UK handing over Hong Kong to the Chinese Communist Party. It will be very interesting to see how the UK Hong Kong sort of angle progresses over time, because it is something that is a very UK specific sort of aspect of Cold War II, right? There's it's something where we're normally just looking at America and China and how they're facing off against each other, but this is an angle which the UK has a very special part to play. And it will be, as I say, it'll be very interesting to see how it turns out. On a similar topic with Hong Kong, it was interesting to see that Singapore has, a lot of Hong Kongers had already fled to Singapore with all their money, seeing that the Chinese Communist Party was cracking down on sort of the money centers in Hong Kong, and they're trying to put it into places like Macau. They're trying to replace Hong Kong with Macau for a lot of Asia's financial system, because, as of course, as many people know, Hong Kong is the financial hub of a lot of Asia. So a lot of investment all across Asia is based in Hong Kong. It's a bit like London, I suppose, for in terms of sort of a financial hub that which finances much of development in the region all around it. But it's interesting to see that Singapore, where plenty of Hong Kongers are already had already fled, is similarly trying to set itself up almost like Taiwan with an interesting new sort of tax structure for hedge funds and investment managers that are getting out of Hong Kong, right? It'll be interesting to see just with the fall of these existing linchpins of the financial hub in that area, how that benefits the neighbors, as we say with Taiwan, you've got and then Singapore, and then Tokyo as well is benefiting from the people fleeing from Hong Kong as well. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, it's like the Brexit story that never happened, right? With in the end, the financial firms moved to London, and jobs expanded in the financial sector, and financial markets are fine despite Brexit. But in Hong Kong, you've got the real deal. You've got a real clampdown of a real trade barrier, and a foreign power that's going to mismanage Hong Kong almost certainly. And I'd love to know what their plans are for Hong Kong, given it's this pearl or this jewel in Asia that's flowing investment funds into all sorts of different parts of Asia, and it's just going to become part of China with those security laws that they've passed recently. That's a huge change, and it's going to be fascinating to see. It's almost like a reversal of the unification of Germany, right? Where you've got East Germany, West Germany, reunifying and becoming capitalist. Well, you've got this reunification into communism. Not that China is especially communist anymore, but to the extent that it is, it's like a reverse experiment of that. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens to the people in Hong Kong, to the economy, and so on and so forth, to see if they can become more like China, or are they going to be a financial center that was but lost its appeal?
Yeah, as you say, I think it'll be very interesting to see how how Cold War II, as it is, develops over time. And it really does seem like there is a lot more pressure when, as you say, where if the Telegraph is writing about this, putting it on the front page and describing it as demographic genocide, then it really is, it is entering the mainstream much more, and it's going to become much more of a political sort of punching bag, the Chinese Communist Party, especially when you're looking at people trying to push foreign policy in the ways that they want. Now, to change the subject a bit, one aspect we'd like to close on today. This is actually something we were talking about a bit in last week's market broadcast. Was the topic of gold and the behavior of gold in very recent times, because it was looking like gold had broken out in a pretty strong fashion, where it really got close to all-time highs in dollars. Of course, it's really not far from all-time highs at all in pounds these days. At the time of writing, I think it's £1,436 an ounce, which really isn't very far. I think it's £1,459 an ounce is the all-time high now in the UK, because the sterling price of gold has been incredibly strong. But the dollar price, as we described, is something that's even more important to the global sort of fundamental value of gold. Now, Nickolai, you were a bit skeptical about gold's breakout recently, and you were saying that you were going to wait for there needed to be another signal for what the gold price is going to do in the near future. You were thinking that there needs to be a much stronger, more bullish sentiment expressed before you can be confident that we were really rocking and rolling in the gold market, right?
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much played out. So the gold price dropped quite far from the highs on the 24th, and then it came back a bit. But it looks like it's giving up those gains again today. So I'm expecting a return back to the lows of what we call the widening distribution, which we explained in the last podcast. So back to about 1675. And if that is correct, then it's not time to buy gold effectively. It's time to delay your gold purchases and your gold stock purchases if you are buying gold stocks or gold. So far, things are playing out as I would have suggested in that last podcast. So at least I'm waiting on buying any gold stocks, and I think you should too.
Right. So what exactly are you waiting for, though? Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so either the gold price has to have a real breakout, by which I mean the price has to go significantly higher before I'm interested, or it has to hit somewhere below 1,675 US dollars, because we've been stuck in a sideways trading range since about April, and it looked like we'd broken out of that sideways trading range. But at least in my book, what happens in these sideways moves is you get lots of false breaks, you get lots of false breakouts. And I'm expecting the current breakout, or the recent one, to prove to be a false one, which would suggest that the gold price goes back down to the bottom of the range before either going sideways again or beginning its proper breakout.
So, in terms of the range that you're looking at, what is the opposite barrier from 1,675?
It's where we are pretty much, 1775, which is where we bounced off and went back down. So you never know how far a false break will go outside of the range. But you do know that once you've re-entered the range after a breakout, then it's likely to be a false breakout, and the price is likely to go back to the bottom of the range.
So it's a $100 tunnel that gold needs to get out of one way or another, right?
Yeah, except the sides of the tunnel sort of get wider slowly. So it's like it's trying to trick you into thinking that it's going to break out, but then it doesn't. And instead of picking the breakouts and buying when it breaks out, people should buy at the bottom of the range, and then whenever it breaks out, it happens to break out. The point being that you bought at the bottom of the range each time gold swiveled down below 1675. That's when you should be buying.
But I mean, the risk there is that it breaks down out of the range, right? So if you buy at the bottom of the range and then it breaks down, I mean, you're sitting on a loss.
That's right. So you got to wait for the false breaks on the low side to turn around. So after 1675 is broken on the downside, the market turns back up into the range, and that's when.
Very good. I think that's a good way to sort of bookend this market broadcast. Thank you very much for listening to this, and Nickolai, thank you very much for joining me as ever. We shall be back again on Friday this week. We shall be doing 3 per week. We'll be moving it to 2 per week, but we shall be back then, where we'll be discussing some of the interesting news that comes out this week. It's looking very, very chaotic. Pretty much every week we've had over the last couple of months has been really wild. There's always been some very interesting news stories, very chaotic stuff. Last week it was Wirecard. Let's see what happens this week. That's all for now. If you are interested on following us on Twitter, you can find Nickolai Hubble and myself if you just search for our names. And we shall be back with you on Friday.